Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our latest podcast episode. And today in our episode, we are going to talk about something near and dear to our heart, something that accounts for a large portion of our business here at AmLaw, and something that's actually near and dear because it involves our neighbors to the north. And to discuss that topic, which in particular is E-2 visas and E-2s in particular for Canadians, I've invited our business development director, Alexander Verbitsky, here to join us in our call today. Alex, how are you doing?
Very good, sir. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Very good. Yes, awesome. And so the funny thing is, or maybe not funny, but Alex himself is Canadian. He's based in Toronto. He's our business development director. And in the course of today's discussion, he'll give a lot of insights as well as to what he's seen both as a Canadian himself, but also the work and the conversations he's having with our clients, our potential clients, people that are inquiring about, possibly relocating temporarily to the U.S., maybe on a long-term basis. And I think, he and I will have an interesting dialogue talking about some misconceptions that a lot of Canadians have about visa options to the U.S., maybe misconceptions they might have about E-2. And, what are some issues that Canadians often run into and, what kind of solutions we can come up with. So I think, Alex, this should be a interesting conversation and
Yeah, for sure.
various
This is
fronts.
going to be a very, very interesting conversation because I speak to so many people on a daily basis, and it's just incredible. I guess the similarities in people's questions and concerns, and it is applicable to all aspects. Doesn't matter what business you're involved in, what industry you're involved in. It's pretty similar. So it's interesting, and I'm
Well,
excited to
here's
talk
an
about it.
interesting thing too. Yeah, and we'll get into that conversation. I think, like you said, we're all special, right? And our mothers tell us that every day, how special you are and I am, right? But when you're looking at visas and stuff like that, like you said, people think they're really unique. Like, I've got this really unique business in Ontario, and I've got this really unique situation and stuff. But there's more similarities than differences, I think, right? As you've working with our clients, you've noticed that as well.
Yeah, correct. Definitely one similarity that we've experienced at AmLaw is the similarities in the businesses that people are opening up in the States, right? And it really derives from, what are you currently operating in Canada? And they want to transfer those skill sets and that business over to the US.
Right.
So I think that's the main thing. Yeah.
Well, maybe if we could start with that. So, just to provide context, so everybody knows we're on the same page, right? So, what is an E-2 for those people who don't know what an E-2 is? I would say, probably without a doubt, it's probably the most popular option for Canadians looking to come to the U.S. on a temporary basis. I suppose a TN visa might be just as popular, but it's very narrow. With the TN visa, right, you need to have an employer, and it's only available to people in certain occupations. And I don't believe the spouse can work in that. So there are a lot of limitations. So I think if you're a Canadian, even if you're thinking of permanent residency coming to the U.S., or even if you're not, I think E-2 is the best option. And what the E-2 involves is you've got to either acquire an existing business or open a new one. And whether you're acquiring one or opening a new one, you need to invest or pay for an existing business about $100,000. Could be a little bit less, but we usually encourage about $100,000 and above. And we'll go into that. You don't need to. You can't just keep the $100,000 paying parked in your U.S. company bank account. You've got to spend most of it and commit the remainder of it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for the most part, just keep in your mind, you've got to put about 100K into your U.S. company. And then once you get that right, the timelines are pretty short. And the approval rates are great. We've never had a denial for a Canadian citizen, for getting an E-2 ever. Actually, now that we talk about it, I can't remember the last time. Oh, we did. We've had one. I was going to say, I don't think for any visa we've ever had a denial, but we did have one Canadian denial for an EB3. But other than that, whether it's an EB5, EB1A, other stuff. So we work well with our Canadian clients. But the E2 is very popular because by U.S. immigration considerations, it's relatively fast. From the time we start with you to the time you can get into the interview at the consulate, you're looking at maybe 6 months, maybe 5, maybe 4 if things work really well. So by U.S. immigration terms, that's really good timing. So Alex, let's talk about maybe like types of businesses, right? What are the types of businesses you see with Canadian clients who are looking to use an E2?
Yeah, so it really varies. I think what we've been getting a lot lately is number one, truck drivers. Okay, people that are looking to open an owner operator business in the trucking industry, delivery industry in the States. So it's not only limited to, let's say, commercial trucking, but also, I've had multiple discussions with people that, let's say, transport. Individuals that want to transport and do transport goods, so like raw material, okay, for construction, either it's gravel, soil, all
Right,
that
right,
stuff,
right.
right? And then we've also been getting a lot of tradespeople in general. A lot of builders looking to, open up and expand their business into the US or just completely move over to the US. So we've been seeing a lot of that. Um, you know, like most recently, what we've seen, um, you know, clients that we've are currently representing are in the rental business. Okay, they're in the event rental businesses. So flower walls, chairs, tables for weddings, birthdays, and whatnot.
Carnivals, even carnivals. You remember that one client that they do booths at summer carnivals and stuff like that, and they travel around. That's a
Yeah,
very niche business. That's very niche. I mean, I have to
yeah.
admit, that's unusual.
Very, very. But yeah, it really is broad. But we've been seeing like the gym owners, okay, looking to open up a gymnastics gym
Mhm.
in the States, and they currently are operating one in Canada. Um, who else have we seen?
Well,
Current
I
client.
suppose, correct me if you have a different opinion, but I guess for the majority of people, it's kind of like whatever they've been doing in Canada and works well for them, and they know they're probably best positioned to do that in the US. Just kind of right to continue the
Exactly.
whole thing. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, learn a new trade or a business. You just kind of expand what you're doing.
Yeah, in my conversations with people looking to move to the U.S., a lot of times they ask, what business do you suggest I get involved in? And it always comes down to what do you have experience in, right? You don't want to end up purchasing a business or opening up a business that you have no excitement to run, okay, no passion for, or no past knowledge, okay? Not necessarily that you need that past knowledge, as we know, like it doesn't matter what your experience is, it's irrelevant to the E2 application, right? All that at the end of the day matters is that you've invested into this US business and that you've committed to owning and operating the business in the US.
Right, right. So I would think yes. So I think the vast majority of our clients, there are exceptions, of course, but they just kind of continue doing what they did well in Canada, and in many cases they already have U.S. clients and U.S. customers, and instead of serving them from the Canadian entity, they just start doing it from the U.S. entity once they get that.
Yeah, but what I wanted to point out is that if you open and register a U.S. business in the States, you can continue your operation in Canada. Okay, let's say you're not applying for the E2 visa now, but you're going to slow roll it, right? So you're in the consulting business. Okay, you're in the IT business, and you want to start building your way towards that E2 visa. And there's no way to force inject capital. Well, you could slow roll that process. Okay, you could register your business, open up that bank account under that business, and start incurring expenses over that period of time. Once you're ready to submit the application and have spent that, let's say that minimum.
Right. That's actually an interesting term of art you're saying, slow roll. And so I think, like you said, that's a really good approach to take for companies that are maybe not very capital intensive. So it could be services business like consulting business, AI, some kind of tech business where there's not a lot of upfront expenditures that you have. And so clients will come to us and say, well, sure, I can put 100,000 in my US business, but if I need to spend that money, 50 to 60,000 of it at least prior to, the interview, I don't need to spend that much in, 2, 3 months. And so, yeah, I think Alex, like you said, you could slow roll it. You get the business going, you start making those expenditures, and, maybe it's going to take you 6 months or 9 months to spend that 50 or 60,000. That's fine. There's no time limits, for getting the E2. So let's say you just get the business going, you start making expenses, you maybe travel to some trade shows and stuff like that. And you got flight expenditures and booth, rentals that you got to do and stuff like that. Yeah, and so after, say 6, 9 months, you've made those expenditures, then we can, proceed with the E2.
Exactly. And this goes to the point of like even timelines of everything, right? Our average timeline is 60 to 90 days to create that application and submit it. Okay. However, it's also dependent upon our clients to force inject capital into that business, right? So when it comes to businesses that it's easy to, let's say, inject capital, like I always like the idea of a landscaping business, right? You buy the truck, the trailer, the backhoe, the skid steer. They're all high ticket items, okay, that you could purchase to get your company ready to operate in the States, okay? So those companies, yeah, we 100%, 60 to 90 days, we can create that application. However, when it comes to this concept of slow rolling, I think what's really important, what is really valuable for these people that are operating, these non high expenditure business or non high they don't have a large overhead and capital injection requirement to operate the business. This is definitely a valuable information for them because you could slowly build up that expenditure, that capital injection.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. And we're always looking for good landscapers down here in the U.S. Let me tell you, boy, or at least in Florida, boy, they just it's always hit or miss, with who you get. But anyway, talking about landscaping and real estate, I think one other line of business that we didn't talk about too that's also amenable for E2 is maybe real estate developers, house flippers, right? People that want to flip houses and or maybe just do small residential repairs and stuff like that. Big demand for that kind of stuff in the U.S. I think in certain markets definitely. I'm not speaking so much about flippers, but although I think the market is maybe not as good as it was before for house flipping, but certainly in terms of like house repairs, home repairs, painting, that kind of stuff that doesn't require a general contractor's license. Yeah, definitely looking
Yeah.
at demand for that.
So let's actually get into that a little bit, okay? Because we actually get a lot of people calling and saying that they want to purchase real estate in the United States, either flip the properties, let's say become like a contractor, but their business idea is real estate. I want to get into real estate, right? And I always give them the response of, well, it's not technically, you can't just purchase a real estate asset and then get a visa for it. Okay. So my question to you is, what's the minimum requirement if someone wants to get into flipping properties, okay, or renovating properties and doing the Burr method, buy, renovate, rent, refinance, right? What is the requirement?
Well, so that's a really good question. If we're talking about buying, repairing, renovating, and flipping, you could probably get by with even just purchasing one property. It always looks better the more properties you have, because if it's just one property, the officer might be a little skeptical that, well, this isn't really serious. This is kind of just a hobby for you. You bought this unit. Maybe you're going to actually live there. I mean, sometimes they have suspicions that the client's planning to live there. They're just buying, personal residence or apartment for themselves, and they're saying they're going to renovate it. But let's say first of all, there's that first requirement. You've got to invest at least 100,000. Okay. So there's not a lot of real estate you can buy in the US for less than that. So let's assume you clear that hurdle. So whether it's a condo, an apartment, whatever you buy, a house, you're going to clearly exceed that amount of investment. If you only invest that money in one unit and you're going to do one unit at a time, I think you can make a good case of it as long as you're careful to cover all the other bases. Ideally, this is ideal. I'm not saying it's 100% required, but ideally, if you could even get that work started before you go in for your interview, that always strengthens your case, because any doubts they might have would be dispersed by if you can go to them and say, hey, look, 6 months ago, we bought this apartment. I hired a foreman or something. He's managing all the work. John Smith here in Canada, am not doing any of that work. We've got a foreman. He's kind of managing the subs, and we got a tile guy coming in and doing the tile, and we got a painter doing that stuff. And look, we bought the apartment for, let's say, 150,000, and we've put 30 grand into it and the repairs, and pretty soon that's going to be almost ready. And, once we sell that, we're going to go to the next property or buy the next one. So I think if that would be an ideal case. Now, you don't have to have it, absolutely ideal. Let's say you haven't started the work. that's okay as well. But like I said, it would have little better optics if you maybe purchase two properties, or you could show you're in the process of acquiring the second one, or you have an option on a second property. I
Yeah,
would hope.
I would say the same thing because to me, if I was the officer, it like you mentioned, right? Like there's always concerns that, well, you purchase the property and you're renovating it, but what are the chances that, after we approve the visa, that you'll just live in the
Exactly
property
right.
and
Right.
not
Yeah.
and not sell it or rent it out, right? It sounds like that the best option for the highest probability of an accepted E2 application is to have two active job sites at one time. And I'll tell you this, like people in Canada love multi-residential. Okay.
Hmm.
So that's another really, really good question is that, okay, it's not a one condo, it's not a single family dwelling. Okay.
Right. Right.
It's two or more apartments
Right.
on one property.
Yeah.
So now the question is, all right, if I purchase a multi-residential property, only one of them, one address, how is that viewed? Okay.
I think that's a good point. I think that would be pretty safe. I think you'd be safe in it because even if they have that concern, like you're planning to live there, okay, maybe there's 5 units. Okay, theoretically, maybe you could take up residency in one of the 5 units, but there's still other units there. So as long as it's one property, you got 4, 5, 6 units there, whatever. I don't think that's a big concern.
So
That's a
what
good
what
idea.
kind of business would we register them as?
What do you mean? What
Like,
kind of business?
would they be a contracting business? Or would they be a property management business? What what
Well,
what sort of
I
industry are we looking at?
Well, so as far as like property management goes, that varies by the state, what they view. But I think generally states would say, and now here's a good question. I don't know the answer. Like in Florida, where we're based, I think you need to get a property management license if you're managing third party properties. So in this case, if the company owns, the property you're talking about, even if it's a multiplex, whatever, you don't that's really not treated as property management, even though the company might be managing because the company owns it. You only run into these licensing issues, I think, when you're managing third party properties. And some states you might have to manage more than three or something before you need a license. Some states there's no license required at all. And like I said, I think in Florida, I could be wrong. If you're managing anything that belongs to a third party, then you might have to get a license. Again, usually it's not very complicated, I don't think, but yeah, you're going to have to check into that. For
But in the aspect of, sorry to cut you off,
Mhm.
Charles. But in the aspect of if you're looking to buy, renovate, and sell,
Yep.
what kind of company are you? What are we registering these people as?
Well, I don't know how it is. Maybe it's different in Canada. In the U.S., generally, you don't have to specify, the exact, what your line of business is. I mean, usually it's just assumed you're going to do anything that's legally allowable, unless you're engaged in some profession that always requires a license, like architecture, law, doctor. You always need a license for those kind of things. So if they're doing this kind of buy, renovate, and flip, it would just be a typical LLC. I mean, in the business plan, sure, we'd indicate, yeah, we're going to be involved in, you know, I don't know what's flipping is more the conversational term of art, right? But just, engaged in purchasing, renovating, and reselling real estate, something like that. So I think that's a very common model, and it's good. Now, you mentioned property management. That's also doable. And we have E2 clients that are doing purely property management, right? So they're not doing renovations unless it's properties that they're managing and it's a small, repairing, broken windows, stuff like that. Property management works as well for E2. Honestly, I would say, I mean, it depends on the situation. I would think the buy, renovating, and flipping model is a little bit better for the E2. If you're just managing, you're not going to be buying the property, you're just managing third-party properties. What I would keep in mind is you need to kind of have at least a adequate base in your portfolio for them to kind of approve your E2. So you could use some properties that you or your company own, but you probably want to have some third-party properties. How many do you need to have in order to get the E2 approved? Good question. Probably depends on the size. Like if they're multi-family units as opposed to just individual apartments, maybe you don't have to have as many units. But I would say, a general rule of thumb is roughly like 5 properties or more. Because if you
No,
only
it's
have,
not bad.
yeah, I mean, if you have only one or two properties, they're going to say, look, this isn't serious. This is just like some kind of hobby or something. Now, we have had clients that they only owned all the properties themselves, right? And so I would say again there too, sometimes people say, "Can I just buy an apartment, manage that, and use that for an E2? My apartment costs $500,000." Well, okay, you're clearly investing more than 100,000, but no, if it's just one apartment, they're going to treat that as a passive business model, and that wouldn't satisfy the E2 requirement.
Exactly. The active business has to be the main investment, right? So I think we're a lot of people, even in the property management business side of things. Okay, number one, everything's virtual right now, right? So you could essentially launch your property management business in the States, take on clients, okay, and then you have your, let's say, book of business to, in case of any emergencies, to call, right? But essentially, you're just collecting rent, okay, and you're managing tenants, right? So you could technically start advertising your property management business in the States while you're in Canada, take on clients, and at that point, when you get that, let's say, minimum five clients in your book of business, then we can say you have a strong case for an application. However, there's also the idea of the investment requirement. Okay. So we deal with a lot of issues when it comes to property management, or people that want to get into property management of where do I invest $100,000 into, right? So I would say in most cases that we've seen at AmLaw is that individuals are purchasing property management companies rather than starting one from scratch. Okay. Because there's not much expenditure that you have to invest into advertisement on the onset, right? I mean, let's say you are spending $2,000 to $2,500 a month to advertise to property owners of your property management business. Okay, well, eventually you get the minimum five requirements. I mean, you spent, let's say, 4 or 5 grand, right? So where do I invest the remaining, $55,000 plus $40,000 in the bank account earmarked for future expenses? Like,
Right.
where does that go?
Well, I would think that's why I think even if you're doing a property management business for E2, I think most of our clients, if they're not buying an existing company where they might have to spend 100, 200,000, I think they're going to have to at least buy one or two properties for their own portfolio, right? They can't rely solely on managing third parties. They spend
Okay.
100,000, buying an existing property or something.
So my question is, then that means that if the client that is looking to purchase properties in the United States and also manage those properties, does the purchase of those properties go towards that investment minimum that
Sure.
we require our clients to
Yep.
have?
Yep. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Goes towards that.
Okay.
So that can be a way to get around that issue. Absolutely. Right.
Gotcha. Perfect.
So let's see what else here. Here's something, I guess. So we've been talking about the money that people are investing into the U.S. business, roughly 100,000. But I know, Alex, you talk to a lot of people that might say, well, I've got some cash. I might not have 100,000 in cash and I don't even need all that cash. I've got some equipment, whether they've got a landscaping business or a trucking business and something. And they say, hey, can I contribute this in kind into the U.S. company? How do you deal with those situations?
Yeah, exactly. So, like, what you can do to satisfy the minimum requirements in the E2 application is transfer your existing assets that you own or that your company owns in Canada, right? So right now I'm speaking to a lot of builders, for example, in Canada, in, let's say, the Greater Toronto area, that own the skid steers, that own the trucks, that own, let's say they're a plumbing business and they have, cameras that cost 5,000 on its own, right? So they have a truck that's outfitted with all the tools and equipment that they need to operate the business, and probably the value of the truck and everything inside it is probably worth 80 to 150,000, right? Easily. So all of that can be utilized in your application as an asset transfer to the US LLC. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the way. I mean, you're still gonna have to put some cash into the business. They want to see some cash for operating expenses and whatnot. But yeah, if you've got a bunch of equipment that's worth 80,000, and it's in your Canadian business, yeah, you can contribute that to the U.S. company, and that will count towards those requirements. Now, I suppose maybe here we want to talk a little bit. This might be getting too much into the weeds, but talking about, okay, how do you legally make that transfer, right? And I know you talk to a lot of clients. They say, okay, I've got 80,000 worth of equipment in my Canadian company. can I transfer that equipment directly then from the Canadian company into the US company? There's really, I guess, two ways they could transfer those assets to the US company. They could transfer them directly from the Canadian company into the US company, or they could transfer them from the Canadian company to the Canadian owner, and then the Canadian owner puts it in the US company. So here's the question of the day. Why would they even want to do that second route, which sounds like it's so circuitous, right? You got to go to the investor himself and then from the investor into the US company.
Yeah, so a simple answer to that is that the E2 investor is the person that is getting the visa. Okay, so it's not the entity that the E2 investor owns in Canada is getting the visa. It's the E2 investor, the person that is getting the visa. Okay, so that's why this asset transfer has to happen, or the investment has to come from the person and not the company or business that they own in Canada.
But there is an exception, I guess. And here's where the lawyers get involved, right? So generally, like you said, Alex, that's the scenario for probably 95% of our cases, maybe even more. So it's the individual person who owns the U.S. company so all the investments have to come from that individual person. So if the assets are in the name of a company in Canada, not in that person, then the company has to somehow transfer those assets to the individual, and the individual contributes them to the U.S. company because that individual is the owner of the company and that individual is the person getting the visa. Now, we can complicate things here, maybe make it a little bit easier for people depending on their situation. You could have a scenario where the Canadian company transfers those assets directly to the U.S. company, and that would work for the E2. That situation would only work provided that the Canadian company is the owner of the U.S. company. So not John Smith, but it's the Canadian company who owns the U.S. company. Since the Canadian company owns the U.S. company, then the investment has to come from the company, not from John Smith. So in those cases, the cash coming in would come in directly from the Canadian company to the U.S. company, and any assets or equipment, stuff like that. So, this is a question I think, Alex, we have to, we can provide clients with these options, but they probably have to talk to their accountants in Canada, maybe the U.S., to find out which is more advantageous from a tax perspective.
Yeah, 100%. So the follow-up question with that is that what visa is the person, John Smith, getting if the company is the investor into the U.S. business?
Right. So that's a good question too. So in both cases, it's an E2 visa. But when John Smith is the owner of the U.S. company, he's getting so there's two types of E2 visas, basically. When it's John Smith owning the U.S. business, he's getting the E2 as an investor. Right. So he's the owner and he's supposed to manage and direct the development of the U.S. company. If it's the Canadian company that owns the U.S. company, then any employees of the Canadian company that want to come here to the U.S. to manage the U.S. company, they have to be what are deemed essential employees. So essential basically means, they can't be, janitors or, low-level employees or something. We have to show that this person's role is critical for the U.S. company's development. So it generally means somebody of a managerial level or higher, executive, something like that, or maybe somebody that has some very unique know-how. Like let's say it's a construction company or something. They install windows, let's say, and this employee, has been installing windows for 15, 20 years, and he knows everything about installing windows, and he's going to train the U.S. staff they hire, et cetera, like that. So that would be a good example maybe of an essential employee. When you're the investor investing individually, they really don't care who you are, right? You could have been, a couch potato for the last 5 years, not working anywhere, not doing anything. You won the lottery, you got $100,000, you decided to invest it in a U.S. company. In that case, they don't really care what your background is, whether you're essential, not essential. You're the owner. And so by virtue of that, they'll give you the E2.
So a very, let's say, simple way to put it, in order for the company, in order for an E2 employee visa to be issued for an essential employee, simply put, you're the owner of the Canadian entity, and therefore the Canadian entity owns the American entity. And therefore, if you're the 100% owner of the Canadian entity, John Smith, okay, you're an essential employee to the American business. Would you say that's correct?
Well, I think in most cases that's probably correct, but technically not always. So there could be an example. I think this is unusual, and you can correct me if you've run around any scenarios like this. But I think you could come across a scenario where John Smith owns a Canadian company. The Canadian company owns the US company. So that means any E2 applicants need to be quote unquote essential employees. But if John Smith is the owner, but he doesn't really work at the company. Let's say, his brother is the COO. His brother's doing all the day-to-day, work at the company. He's just sitting back, relaxing, on the shores of, Miami Beach or something. I don't know. He's the owner of the Canadian company, but he's not doing anything. You might have a scenario where they're going to say, well, wait a second, do you know anything about this business? Are you managing the business? Are you receiving a salary there? And if his answer to all these questions is no, he's like, I'm just, taking it back easy, getting, my dividends, but I'm not actually involved. He might have a problem proving he's an essential employee. But I think, as Alex, from, our experience, I think that's a very unusual situation, right? I don't think you have too many clients like that. Right.
It sounds like to me, Charles, is that the better option between the two is to be the investor rather than the company you owning in Canada being the investor.
It could be. It might be a little bit safer that way, right? Right. It might be a little bit safer, but there could be tax reasons, I think. And again, you'd probably need to really talk with your, Canadian accountant. That there could be reasons, I think, where there might be advantages if the Canadian company does own the U.S. company directly. But you know what? Strangely enough, that's a very rare scenario that we deal with. So I guess it's maybe not that advantageous. Otherwise, I think more people would do it that way.
A really good question that I get asked a lot is the following. Okay. Someone wants to open up a business in the States. Their children are over the age of 21, and they think that they can hire their son or their daughter as an E2 employee visa. So they are the E2 investor, and they would like to hire their children as an E2 employee. What do you say about that?
That's interesting. I guess you have very interesting conversations with these people. I can't remember the last time I've had a discussion about that. What scenario we have discussed, or I have discussed relatively recently even, is where same situation that you're talking about, but they want to bring the children on as co-investors. So, they've got a 22-year-old son. They want to get the E2, but they want the son to also do it. So we've oftentimes discussed having the adult child be a co-investor. And so to do that, you'd have to be 50-50 split between the parents and one of the children. Now, if you've got two children and you want both of them, it's not going to work, right? You can only have two co-investors for any one business, and each co-investor can get the E2. So we've had that discussion. I can't say many clients go through with that. Maybe for a number of reasons, and so maybe I'll address your point, because I think in your scenario that you're posing, it's even a more challenging situation. So let's say they're like, no, I don't want to give my child 100,000 and they can co-invest in my company, but I want to hire them. See, here we're getting back to that definition of essential employee. And if your child is, still in college or university and they haven't graduated, or they recently graduated and they have little, if any, experience, and on top of it, they're your child, which they're obviously going to see, I think that's going to be a stretch at the embassy. I think that's going to be a challenge. Did you get a lot of inquiries about that? I guess maybe you do.
Yeah, 100%. Sorry, I'm just going to cut here, Charles. We're discussing with people that have large businesses. So even if their children are their children, okay, they still have a lead role in the business. Okay, so we're not talking about mom and pause here.
The child has a lead role.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Let's say someone is running an electrical business, and one of their children is a foreman or a lead hand at in one of their, let's say they have three teams, right? And their son or daughter is the lead hand and manages a group of 3-4 apprentices, right? So you could have that similar aspect in the U.S. company that you're opening, right? So John Smith owns an electrical company, and he wants to open up an electrical company in the U.S. In order to establish and train new hires, they're going to need their essential employee to come down to the States, okay, and train new hires. And who does that person so happen to be? It happens to be John Smith's son.
Right.
right?
Okay.
So is that, let's say, maybe it's not common, but is it possible?
Oh yeah, definitely. So again, there's children and there's children, right? You could have a child who's 40 years old and a child who's 22, right? And I suppose there's a big difference between those in experience and knowledge and whatever. So if we're talking about a child, loosely, but they're really adult children, but they are playing an important role in the Canadian company and they're heading up a group or they're one of the foremans or they're, project managers. Yeah, then I don't see a problem at all in terms of hiring your kids. If you've got a business and we can show that the children have been working there for a while, what's a while, 3 years, 5 years, they've got some experience, and we can show that their role is important here. And what I would say is probably the best way to show that they have an essential role in the US is, like you just mentioned, Alex, that they're going to be kind of training people here. That's always that's always an easy way to meet that definition of essential. They've got the experience. They're going to come here. They're going to train the dumb Americans who don't know how to, drywall or do anything like that. And so, yeah. So, yes, that in those kind of scenarios, yeah, I don't think that having the familial relationship, that's going to create any problems.
Okay. Great information. E2 investors want to come down to the States and they want to, let's say, expand their business as rapidly as possible, but they need to hire people that are knowledgeable in their industry, in their business. What options do they have?
Well, that's a great question, and in fact, there's great options that do exist for business owners in Canada who are expanding here in the U.S. and they need to send down important or essential employees. And what that option is basically the owner doesn't necessarily have to get an E2 visa. He can get an E2 employee visa for his critical key employees who are going to come down here and help lead the U.S. expansion. So I think from an employer's perspective, if you're the owner of the Canadian business, you can say to your guys, hey, I'm going to pay you, these wages, you get a promotion, you go work in the U.S. And on top of that, your spouse can go with you, your family can go with you. Your spouse, the spouse of the employee coming down here, gets, open-ended employment authorization. He or she can work wherever they would like. Children can come down here. They can go to school. If they're going to go to university or college, they're treated just like in-state residents, like any other, green card holders or citizens in terms of paying tuitions, right? So if you're, a resident in Florida, Texas, California, and you're going to an in-state college in any of those states, you're going to pay in-state rates, even though you only have an E2, you don't have a green card. And on top of that, which I think is most appealing maybe to employers, is you don't have to worry too much about your employee running off and getting, snatched by another employee or employer, because this E2 is a closed-end visa, right? It's only available for that employee as long as he works for your company. If he wants to switch companies or something, he's going to lose his status. He's going to have to, start from scratch to get a new visa.
Yeah, what a great opportunity for the E2 investor. It's to hire someone that's going to be with you by your side and help you full force expand your business in the US.
Right, exactly. And that's a good thing about the E2 too, as well, in that, you can bring your employees down here and it creates a lot of opportunities for the employees' families, right? They can bring their kids, they can bring their spouses. The spouses actually have more freedom than the employee, right? The employee is linked to the employer, but the spouses receive just, regular work authorization. They can work for anybody. And
Yeah,
so
fantastic.
yeah. So that's really a great appeal.
Perfect. Let's discuss about just going back a little bit. I think we touched base really good on like all the E2 investor, E2 employees, the different possibilities. Okay, let's go back into asset transfer, and I want to get this concept of evaluating the assets. Okay, so how does someone evaluate the asset that in order to bring it down to the U.S. company, right? So I guess one option, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if I bought a backhoe or a skid steer for $20,000, I have to show receipts for that, or I have to get a third party assessment. Is that correct?
Right. Yep. I think either would work. I mean, I suppose if you bought, it depends on how old it is, right? I mean, if you bought this 15, 20 years ago, I don't think it's going to work to provide a receipt because obviously, stuff depreciates. If it was purchased relatively recently, you probably could just get by with having a proof of, purchase receipt, bill of sale or something like that. But otherwise, if you get a third party, assessment, that would work fine as well.
Okay, great. So it really matters about the current value of that asset,
Mhm.
not necessarily what you paid for it 15 years ago. It matters currently, what's it valued,
Right.
right? So when it comes to getting that assessment, what do we typically use? What is there a service that we refer out? Is there maybe a dealership that can assess the value of it? Or is like simple Facebook Marketplace listings, 10 of them of the same product eligible to assess value? What do we do?
That's a clever suggestion about Facebook. You know what, to be honest, we don't have uh, specific contacts in Canada or any other markets where we could say, here's an appraisal company, go to them, they'll give you an assessment. I think you're just going to have to find, any company in your market, in your country where you're at. Maybe they could do it remotely. They might not have to be, in the same town as you. They might, be able to just look at a video of the property or something, or the equipment, and they might be able to do an assessment that way. So I think the best way to avoid any problems is getting a third party, assessment. And I think the embassy is relatively flexible. They're not requiring that the guy making the assessment physically come there, touch the equipment, look at it. But as long as, they've got some kind of license or reputable name or something, and they say, yeah, we view this equipment as being worth X, Y, and Z. How much that would cost, I really don't know. I don't know if you've run across that in Canada, Alex, what they would charge for that. But I'm not sure.
Always comes into our IT clients, and they have intellectual property that they own, that they've developed. They've injected sweat equity into the build out of a certain product. Okay, how do we assess that?
Well, I think that would probably be done in the same way, right? Trying to get a third party assessment, and that's a very good question. They're generally not going to accept some self assessment, right? Hey, I created this new app. I think it's worth, $500,000. That's probably not going to work. But I think, if you could get some kind of assessment, and you know what, it doesn't have to necessarily be in your home country as well. So if, you get a company from the US, or even, I don't know, somewhere in Europe or something that maybe can assess the value of your intellectual property, I think that would work as well.
Oh, you know what? I want to talk about ratios. Okay, someone with $100,000 truck, okay, can't just simply, or like someone can't just, let's say they're in the trades business and they buy a truck, okay, that's worth $100,000. Does that qualify them? Right? In order to run let's say a plumbing company,
Uh-huh.
I need a service truck. That brand new truck costed me $100,000. I didn't finance it. In my application, I don't have any other tools and equipment other than my truck, right? Like that's a huge question, and I think we deal with a lot of ratios at the firm. Okay, we want to show that yes, I have all the tools to run my business in the United States, not just a partial amount.
Correct. So I think in any case where you only have one item that accounts for all or nearly all of your expenditures, that's a weak case, because that's going to raise a number of questions, right? And kind of what you alluded to, it might raise questions about how viable of a business is this going to be. I mean, how can you buy a truck, but you don't have any of the equipment? You don't have operating capital or cash, for other expenditures, payroll, stuff like that. So there always has to be some kind of combination. Now, you might buy a truck, and that might account for 80% of, your upfront startup costs. But we still, in any case, you've got to show that everything has been purchased, everything's in place for the company to immediately start operations once the applicant gets the visa and comes to the U.S. So you can't put stuff in here like, I've got 20,000 in the bank and I'm planning to buy 20,000 worth of tools once I get my E-2 and I come here. Or, I'm going to rent an office after I get here. No, that has to be all in place before. Well, as we're probably coming to the end of this episode, Alex, and I think as our viewers probably noticed, there's a lot of opportunities here for Canadians. Whether, again, you've got your own business or whether you're working at a larger business, and it covers just about any type of business as well, whether you're dealing with the trades, real estate management, real estate development, IT, stuff like that. I think that's an appealing thing about the E-2 visa, isn't it? In terms of, its applicability for so many people.
Yeah, 100%. I tell people all the time, any business that's available under the sky, under the stars, the moon, and the sun, okay, is a viable business that can be part of the application. Okay, you could open up any business you could dream of. in order to be getting an E-2 application approved.
Right, right. And it's like we discussed, it's not only applicable for the owners of businesses, but it could be even just as advantageous for their employees. So even if the owner doesn't want to come here to the US, but they're planning an expansion, you can structure the E2 well to bring over your key players, bring them to the US. And that might be a good retention tool with them too. Hey, some people might want to have the opportunity to come to the US for a couple of years to work. And that might be an appealing aspect as well. So hopefully this was of benefit for everybody, whether you're Canadian or not. But in particular, as you realize, we focused on Canadians in this episode. And I look forward, Alex, to having some similar discussions, whether it's regarding Canadians or other visa types with you in the future, to help shed some light on these opportunities.
Yeah, I'm super excited to continue on this conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Very good. And for everybody else, thanks again. And please feel free, if you're considering immigrating to the U.S. for a temporary basis or long-term, getting a green card, or whether it's just coming here for a couple of years to launch in your business and going back to your home country, feel free to reach out directly to us. You'll speak with Alex or myself, and we're happy to guide you and prepare an individualized strategy to make your transition as comfortable and convenient as possible.